This morning, I want to think for a moment about distractions. We live in a very distracted, noisy sort of a world. Um, it's not just that things are loud. There's audio noise. There's visual noise. There's all sorts of noise that we encounter. We have these little computers that we carry around in our pockets that beep and buzz and vibrate and ding and provide countless hours of various different kinds of visual and audio stimulation, so that at no point during the day, if we choose to, do we ever really have to be bored, or do we ever really have to be alone? Now, this isn't a new phenomenon. All the way back in 2006, my first job out of college, as auspicious as this sounds, I worked in photo development and guest services at a Target in suburban Chicago. And half of that job position doesn't exist anymore at any Target anywhere. And so a lot of the time when I wasn't developing pictures, I was supposed to go help with returns and everything like that. But once a week, and sometimes more often, but at least once a week, a customer would come to me with a complaint. You might want to turn the music back on, is what the customer would say. Or there's no music. And I'd say, what do you mean? And they go, well, there should be music playing. Well, we never have music playing. And that was the thing. Target corporate policy was no music playing in the store. And it just astonished and frustrated people to no end that there wasn't music playing while they shopped. And don't get me wrong, I love music. But one of the things that was nice about working at Target was there wasn't this constant background noise. When you were working, you could talk to your coworkers, you could think, you could focus on what you were doing. And when you're shopping, you can pay attention to the things that are going on, and you can have conversations with people very easily. And if you don't like the music, if you go into a store and you don't like the music, there's nothing you can do about it. But that's beside the point. People wanted that level of distraction. They wanted that little distraction in the background, that little noise that was constantly going on. Here's another story. I worked at a church camp, or helped out, volunteered at, led church camps for several years. And when I first started leading camps at this one particular camp, there was no cell phone reception, none. Not one bar, not 1 ounce. There were 0 internets. There was no, you could not get a call. You couldn't send a text, nothing. You went out there, you were in complete and utter digital isolation. And it was marvelous. And the students who would immerse themselves in this life during the other 51 weeks out of the year, when they came to camp, it was a week free of this particular type of distraction. And we could focus on what was going on in their life with Jesus. Then one cell phone company put a tower up close enough to camp that you could start to get signal. And when one put a tower up, well, the other one's got to have a tower. And so pretty soon, no matter what company you were with, you could get all of the internet. And suddenly, we weren't just dealing with the interpersonal relationships in the camp. We were dealing with things that were happening outside camp that were coming into camp through mobile phones. We're people who love to be distracted, because when there's 2 elements to this, I think. One is, when we're distracted, we can be formed and shaped by something else. When you're distracted, other things can go on around you, and messages can happen and can get into your mind and your body that we really just we take for granted. We take for granted that these things are happening, and it's a way of forming us and molding us and shaping us. I remember 40 or 50 years ago, people were worried about subliminal messages being inserted into in between frames of a movie that would make you want to get up and buy more popcorn. But if you've ever eaten popcorn, you already want more popcorn because popcorn's fantastic. I digress. We were worried about having these messages sent when we're distracted. And now all of these messages come into us through our phones, through our televisions, through YouTube. They come in because we want to make sure that we're never left to be bored. We're told that being bored or being alone is the very worst thing. And as an extrovert, I don't love being alone, but I know it's a necessity to balance out the very outgoing side of me. The other thing I think we avoid distraction, the thing that makes us avoid distraction, is that when we're distracted, we don't have to deal with ourselves. When we're distracted, we can pay attention to that distraction. We can allow that distraction to give us something to focus on. If I'm cleaning the house and I have a podcast on, I'm not thinking about my relationship with Jesus. I'm not thinking about my sermon. I'm not thinking about Katie. I'm thinking about whether Fulham are going to get promoted back to the Premier League next year. I am taken someplace else and given something else to think about. And that's not necessarily bad, except that all of us live with false selves. All of us live with lies and stories and narratives that we tell ourselves that are not submitted to the lordship of Christ. And when we talk about the idea of solitude, when we talk about the practice of solitude, we are talking about something that strips away distractions and allows us to focus on Jesus. Now, Jesus himself does this. And I intentionally didn't pick the passage where Jesus goes out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. That wasn't the one that Gary read earlier. And I didn't pick it because you also deal with a lot of background things there. But what I did ask Gary to read was the passage where Jesus would regularly go to solitary places. He started his ministry in a solitary place. As I said, in the wilderness, 40 days, 40 nights. But regularly, Jesus would go off into solitude. And it says otherwise, he was surrounded by people. And Jesus went into solitude so that he could reconnect and make sure that he was connected with God in the way that he was meant to. Because the expectation of Jesus, of the Messiah, was that through the work of the Messiah, that all of these things were going to happen, that the Roman occupation was going to be ended, that the temple was going to be purified, that justice would come, the dead would be raised, all of this. And those are all good things. But as they saw time and time again, messianic movements often led to movements of worldly power. Rather than being movements of God amongst God's people, they became movements where whoever has the most swords wins. And knowing that this was a temptation, knowing that this was going to be something that he would be tempted with, Jesus went to the desert and indeed was tempted with this and went to the presence and mercy of God and gave himself over to God so that Jesus could continue the work that he was doing. Regularly, Jesus would go out to solitary places so that he could pray, so that he could connect with God, so that he could eliminate the distractions in his life, and he could focus on what he was supposed to be and who he was supposed to be, and who God had called him to be. Well, the people find out, and his disciples find out, and they go find him. And pretty soon, Jesus has to be very particular about where he goes. And he has to go to even more solitary places because now people keep following him to solitary places because they know this is where he's going. But then we look at the example of Paul. And when Paul was writing Philippians, and in fact, when Paul was writing Ephesians and a few other letters, he was in prison. Paul was imprisoned because he was preaching the gospel of Jesus, and people didn't like it, and they would stir up trouble, and he would end up jailed. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he had disrupted the so-called Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And the peace of Rome was that once you had slaughtered all of your enemies, you had peace. And whenever there was somebody who threatened this particular social order, chuck them in prison. And if they still cause problems, off with their heads, crucify them, whatever you need to do, just be done with them. If they won't change, you can change them. And it was that sort of thing. And so this was why Paul was imprisoned. And when we read in Philippians that Paul does not expect to be ashamed, but expect to continue preaching the gospel, we see somebody who is deeply, deeply acquainted with who he is in Jesus Christ. Paul knows who he is. Paul knows the message that he's been sent to preach, and he's not going to give up on it. And we know this because he loves Jesus so that he's desperate to go see Jesus. And this was actually a problem in the early church because people were so desperate to see Jesus and so desperate to be a witness for Jesus that the highest witness you could offer was a good death for Jesus, was martyrdom. And so they would often race to witness to their faith to the Romans by offering their lives. It was illegal to be a Christian. And so they would offer their lives as a testimony. Well, Paul says, I want to see Jesus, but I also want to continue to do my work, the work of the gospel. And I was tempted. I was struggling because I don't like reading things into the text. I don't like putting things into Scripture's mouth. Enough people do that with things that don't glorify Jesus. And I had hoped that my motives were pure, but then I found 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, and I want to read those to you because Paul has clearly considered his position here. For him to be able to say, I'm going to continue to do this work, I'm not going to be ashamed of the gospel, he has paid for this. And listen to this. We think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through in the province of Asia. We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure, and we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. But as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God who raises the dead. This is a testimony to Paul putting in the work, as my therapist says, putting in the work, doing what he needed to do in this difficult and troubling situation to be able to rely on God and to know the full power of God. And so when we ask ourselves, what work do we have to put in? We can look at Paul. We can see that, yes, Paul is able to say, this is who I am. This is what I believe, only because he went through this experience. Now, these experiences look different for everybody. But one way that I can tell you, as we've been saying, that we can connect with God in a deeper way, and we can understand who God is, who we are in Christ, and what we're supposed to be about, is by the spiritual practice of solitude. And we've seen Jesus do it. And Paul spent lots of time in solitude in prison. But what does that look like for us? Because we're filled with distractions. We're formed by distractions. Whether you have a smartphone or a flip phone, even if you don't have a mobile phone and instead you have a phone attached to your wall with a cord on it, you still have distractions. Whether you're married or single, whether you're young or old, there are things that distract you. And so what do we do to practice solitude in a world that values distraction? What do we do to practice solitude when we live as people who like to be around other people? If the COVID pandemic is teaching us anything, it's that we need people. We need each other. Whether it's on Zoom, whether it's in person, we need each other. And from having been on Zoom for hours and hours and hours, we know the value of being face to face. We get it. But at the same time, we also know that to be able to offer anything to anyone, we have to know who we are. And we have to offer who we are out of a place that is deeply rooted in Jesus. As Psalm 1 said, yeah, this is all intentional. With all of these passages that we've picked this morning, they've all kind of led into this, is like streams, like a tree planted by streams of water. We have to be rooted in our identity in Jesus. And solitude, all of these spiritual disciplines are ways to help us get there. It's belief that leads us to practice, and practice that helps shapes our belief. We believe that we are to be firmly planted in God's love. And so we practice things like solitude for all of the benefits that it offers and all of the fruit that it produces. There's a Christian author named Adele Ahlberg Calhoun who put solitude in the form of this question: who are we when productivity and recognition fall away and God is the only one watching us? This is the purpose of solitude. I'll read that again. Who are we when productivity and recognition fall away and God is the only one watching us? This is a question that we have to come to grips with. Solitude is leaving people and distractions behind for time alone with God. This is difficult because our lives are not built, our lives are not usually formed for us to be by ourselves, focusing on just one thing because of how we're formed to have all these distractions. But if we can offer God solitude, if we can enter into this time of solitude, then we can find out who we are away from the eye of somebody else, away from the idea that we have to be productive beings to have value, and that we can sit with God who created us and values us. So how do you get into this? What are the nuts and bolts of it? Pastor Rich Villodas of New Life Church in New York City, he's got a book out on spiritual formation called, and the title of it has just left me, The Deeply Formed Life, I believe. I sent out a worship recap on Tuesday, and I'll put the name through email, and I'll do that again this Tuesday, and I'll put the name of the book in there when I'm not having a brain fart. It's okay. And so Rich Villodas said this about getting into solitude. Two words: normalize boredom. That's the first thing. Normalize boredom. We think that boredom is something that means we're unproductive. We think that boredom means that we're just lackadaisical. We're not really doing anything. We get told by our bosses, if you've got time to lean, you've got time to clean. But boredom is what happens when you're formed by a world of distractions, and then you enter into solitude. When all the distractions are stripped away, our mind doesn't know what to do. And so when we embrace boredom, when we normalize boredom, we can normalize boredom with Jesus. This is how it starts. This is step one. To get a little bit deeper, take 5 minutes, take 2 minutes, take 90 seconds, and offer those 90 seconds to Jesus, thinking of nothing else but Jesus. If you need to, take a verse like Galatians 2:20, Jesus who loved me and gave himself for me, and put that in your mind, and then spend 90 seconds, 2 minutes, 5 minutes with Jesus, and focus on that, and just focus on Jesus at the forefront of your mind. Things are going to pull at you. Things are going to jump in. And in fact, as I've been trying to study for this sermon on solitude, I don't think I've ever been more distracted in my entire life. It has been work to get ready for this. But whenever you get distracted, as you're offering your life, and when you're offering time of solitude to God, understand that those distractions aren't failures. They're just opportunities to go running back to the love of God. So you start offering this time little by little, away from distractions. Turn your phone off. If you've got the phone on the wall, take it off the hook, yank the cord out, or gently, don't ruin your phone. You might still need that. Somehow people have to get a hold of you about your car's extended warranty. And so do what you have to create a situation where you are alone, and offer that time to God. You could do an activity. You could go on a walk. And as you go on a walk by yourself, you're walking and you're thinking about Jesus. You're walking and you're offering your mind to Jesus. You're walking and you're asking, when productivity and recognition fall away, who am I before God? Who am I in Jesus? You can do the dishes. You can iron. You can clean the house. You can take a shower and be offering this time to God in solitude. It's a place where we go to find out who we are, so that when we come out of this place of solitude, we're not meant to live in the place of solitude, but we're meant to go there so that we can be shaped to be who God meant for us to be, because we go there to meet Jesus, who loves us. Something to consider as you're working on the practice of solitude. It's not easy. There will be distractions from outside. There are distractions from our own mind. And when we are confronting our false selves, and when we are coming to grips with who we are in Jesus, it can be a painful process. In fact, Scripture is very clear that it's going to be a death of some kind. It is going to be dying to our false selves, but we are brought to life in Jesus. But that dying doesn't happen easy. There's a painting called The Horrors of St. Anthony. And Anthony was one of the Christian desert fathers who fled the Roman Empire into the deserts of Africa. And when he was literally alone in solitude all of the time, he had to face all of these greedy and evil and false desires within himself. And we have to do the same thing too. It's not easy work, but it's worth it. It's not easy work, but you don't do it. Ironically, for a practice where I'm telling you, go be alone, you don't do it alone. Because every time we enter into solitude, we enter into the presence of Jesus within ourselves. But this changes us. Solitude enabled Jesus to do what he did. It changes us and it liberates us. It frees us from having to be anything we're not. And this is the biggest endorsement I can give you for engaging with the spiritual practice of solitude. And as I said last week, as we go through February and we look at some of these spiritual practices, these aren't things that you may naturally gravitate towards. These may not be things that you practice and live out all day, every day. And I don't think you're meant to, because they're meant to empower you, not in some sort of relational self-help sort of way, but they're meant to empower you to live the new life of Jesus and to be formed only by God. When we put off these false selves that are often burned away in the fires of solitude, we're liberated, we're set free. Jesus was set free from messianic expectations to actually be the Messiah, to actually show people what it would look like for the rule of God and for the presence of God to be amongst them. Paul was set free. He was set free to be able to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles, the people who had never been a part of God's people, but were still created by God nonetheless, and to call them back to God through Jesus the Messiah. And we look at movements like the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s, which was a deeply prayerful movement. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a deeply prayerful man who had read the works of Christian spiritual people like Howard Thurman and knew of the works of Thomas Merton, and people who were doing this sort of work. And it was only by knowing his value in Jesus and knowing who he was in Christ that Martin Luther King Jr. was able to go and preach a message of God's love for all people, and that all people should be able to be free, and that no one should have to live under oppression. Solitude brings us into a place where, free of the demands of productivity and free of the distractions of the world and free of our need to be recognized, we know who we are in Jesus and that we are so dearly loved.